Good morning, good afternoon, I should say, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the next installment of the Pirkei Avot shiur that I give on a weekly basis. We look at a mishna in Pirkei Avot. We're up to Mishnah Vav in Perek Aleph. I'm going to look at the camera, not at the Zoom. Zoomers will have to forgive me. And those of you who are watching on YouTube, welcome. It's wonderful to have you. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon with my picture on it. If you click on that, or if you just pass your arrow over it, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, which I'd love you to do. So please do that if you're able to. And those of you who are watching it on my website, you can do that as well. You can actually just click onto the screen. It will take you to YouTube, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel and get regular updates of my latest videos, whether they are the Perachia or whether they are Pirkei Avot or Jewish history or the various other things that I do on YouTube. You are welcome to be a subscriber, and we'd love you to join us. Now, I want to look at the sixth mishna of the first perek of Pirkei Avot. We're now on to the next generation of the zugos, of the pairs that we began with a couple of mishnayos ago. And we now have a very interesting pair, and there's a lot of confusion historically about this pair, but I think the confusion is born of a misnomer, and therefore people are confused, but I'm not confused at all, because if you know anything about Jewish history, you'll know the answer. And I think that if you leave Jewish history or history to historians and theology to theologians, you're going to be on much safer ground. Let me explain. The pair in question are Yehoshua ben Perachia and Nitai ha'Arbeli. So these are the two great rabbis in Jerusalem, both of them at the head of the Sanhedrin. One is the Gaivud, one is the Raivud, whatever they called themselves in those days. One was the Nossi, I think that was the name of the head of the Sanhedrin, and there was the Av Bezdin, and they presided over the Sanhedrin. They presided over the religious affairs of the Jewish nation. I think I explained it a couple of weeks back, that the religious affairs had always been in the domain of the Kohanim, but the Kohanim had drifted somewhat from this particular role. And of course we know of the story of the Chashmonaim, the Hasmoneans. The Maccabees had to reclaim Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash from the Greeks, but it wasn't actually the Greeks. It was the Kohanim, their relatives, who had totally abandoned traditional Judaism and had taken over the temple, introduced Greek idolatry into the Beis Hamikdash. And of course they were supported by Antiochus and Antiochus for Epiphanes. But even though the Chashmonaim now became the rulers during the Hanukkah story of the Jewish nation in Eretz Yisrael, nevertheless, 2 generations later, they were no better than the Kohanim that they had usurped and replaced, and therefore the leadership, the religious leadership of the Jewish nation, once and for all went into the hands of the rabbis. It was very, very important that moral, spiritual, religious, halachic guidance was provided for the Jewish nation. There were no longer Nevi'im, there were no longer kings from the tribe of Judah. The Kohanim were not capable of taking on that role, although there were Kohanim who were also rabbis in the Sanhedrin, and there's some discussion as to whether Yehoshua ben Perachia was actually a Kohen. There's disagreement on that. But their primary role was not as Kohanim. That's not how they are known, at least to us. They're known to us through the medium of Chazal. That means that they were representatives of the Jewish faith, part of the Masorah that was initially described at the beginning of Perek Aleph of Pirkei Avos. But let's talk about Yehoshua ben Perachia. Who was he? Yehoshua ben Perachia is most famous in Jewish mythology, that's what I'm going to call it, as the rabbi of Jesus. Yehoshua ben Perachia, Joshua ben Perachia, the Gemara says that he encountered Jesus, got very angry with him as his student, and declared him an outcast, and he blew 400 shofars, and he was menadeh him, he put him in cherem, and even though Jesus came to him. He's called Yeshua HaNotzri. Even though he came to him and begged him for forgiveness and tried to reconcile with his teacher, he was abandoned by Yehoshua ben Perachia, and the rest, as they say, is history. The only problem is it isn't, because history has to fit in with the chronology of events that we know occurred. Yehoshua ben Perachia lived roughly, I don't want to say exactly when, but roughly 200 years before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. When was the Beis Hamikdash destroyed? In Jerusalem, the second temple was destroyed in the year 6970 of the Common Era. 200 years before that was 130 before the Common Era. And we know, at least based on all the evidence provided to us by Christianity, that Jesus was born at around the time, by the way, probably a few years before, that the Common Era began. How do we know that it has to have been before? Because one of the stories that is told about Jesus is that that King Herod sought his death, and King Herod died 4 years before the beginning of the Common Era. So even though, generally speaking, people believe that Jesus was born in the year 0 of the Common Era, that's not possible, because if he was a baby and King Herod was still alive, even if it was the last year of his life, that was 4 years before the Common Era began. But whatever the case may be about King Herod seeking to kill Jesus as a baby, and I'm not going to go into that right now, one thing is for sure, Yehoshua ben Perachia lived long before that. Yehoshua ben Perachia lived at the time of the Hasmonean monarchy. The dynasty was in its full rulership. Certainly Chazal say he lived at the time of King Yanai. Alexander Yanai lived at around that time. And if that's the case, he could not have been the teacher of Yeshua HaNotzri. That being the case, why is he referred to as the teacher of Yeshua HaNotzri? Well, I can't get into the mind of those who edited the Talmud. One thing I can tell you for sure is that the Baalei Tosfos, that is the medieval German and French scholars who annotated the Talmud, on the opposite side of the page in your printed edition to Rashi, they were, generally speaking, they were either relatives of Rashi or students and disciples of relatives of Rashi, and they lasted for around 200 years. After Rashi died in the year 1105. So at least until the 14th century, there were Baalei Tosfos, and they write that the identification of Yeshua HaNotzri in the Talmud as Jesus of Nazareth is a mistake. And it's true to say that Yehoshua ben Perachia had a Talmud called Yeshua HaNotzri, but it's got nothing whatsoever to do with Christianity. We know that at the time of Yehoshua ben Perachia and Nittoy HaArbeli, we know for sure that that was the beginning of the period of the split between the Perushim and the Tzidukim, the split between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and there was great fear that there was going to be a complete undermining of the Jewish faith by the breakaway movement, the Sadducees, the Tzidukim, who were claiming that they were the original sect of Judaism, and that the Perushim had added all the material that we know as Torah Shebaal Peh, but it had no place in Judaism, and they were going back to the original source, etc. And it would fit in with the story that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, who was the leading rabbi of the generation of the split within Jewish life, that he would have a Talmud who was a heretic. Heretic meaning he was a Sadducee. Now it happens to be that his name either was or wasn't Yeshua HaNotzri. Maybe his name was something else completely. And maybe there's some confusion and they just inserted the name Yeshua HaNotzri, which does sound very similar and familiar, similar to Jesus and familiar to us through Christianity. And therefore this confusion came about, either because the man's name was Yeshua HaNotzri, or because that name was erroneously included in the narrative about Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia and his errant Talmud, his errant students. But that being said, we know when Yehoshua ben Perachia lived, which was in around 130 CE, or in just over a century before the Common Era, and at around 200 years before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. He was an extraordinary rabbi. He's mentioned a few times in the Talmud. I'll just tell you one thing that's in Menachos, stuff Kuftes, fascinating Gemara. The Gemara, you know, that people are frightened of great responsibility. But once they are given great responsibility, they don't want to relinquish it. Isn't that right? The people who are given leadership responsibilities, they're frightened. If I'm no longer leader, people won't look at me. So there is, I'm never quite sure if this is tongue-in-cheek or not tongue-in-cheek, but there's this Gemara, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia. He said, if anybody would have asked me before I became the leader, would you like to become the leader? I'd stick him in front of a lion. In other words, I'd want him to die rather than make me the leader, because, said, it's the implication being, I would be so frightened of taking on that responsibility. However, once I became leader, if somebody would say to me, I think that you should step down, do you know what I would do then? I'd throw scalding hot water on top of that fellow. In other words, once I'm the leader, I'd never want to relinquish that position. Now, the Gemara there is with reference to Shaul HaMelech, who was a reluctant king of the Jewish nation. But once he became the king and he was threatened, his position was threatened by David HaMelech, who was not yet King David. He was threatened by this young pretender to the throne. Suddenly he was doing everything in his power to retain the position. So historically we have evidence for this phenomenon. But Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, one of the great leaders of the Jewish nation, one of the great religious figures of our history, quoted here at the beginning of Pirkei Avot, was somebody who recognized the psychology, the underlying psychology of somebody who is thrust into a position of power. With that as a very long and rambling introduction, I think we can now get to the Mishnah itself. Says the Mishnah, what did they say? Yehoshua ben Perachia nita harbeli kiblu mehem. By the way, they received their Torah knowledge from, remember the previous Mishnah was Yossi ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim, and the one before that was Yossi ben Yoezer ish Tzreida. These were the two, the Zug, who preceded Perachia, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia nita harbeli, and they received their Torah knowledge and I guess their position from Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yochanan, and now they delivered the following message. We're going to see what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia had to say. This, by the way, is one of the fundamental teachings of Pirkei Avot and one of the best known. So you may not have realized it was Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia, but you will certainly have heard the lesson. The lesson is as follows. Yehoshua ben Perachia Omer, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Perachia says, Asei lecha rav. Asei lecha rav. Do you know what that means? Find yourself a very good rabbi, a teacher, somebody who knows how to teach, and somebody from whom you will learn a great deal. I'm going to read you the Perush here. Asei lecha rav. Asei lecha rav lelimud haTorah mipi hashemua. Find yourself someone who can teach you Torah from the way he heard it from his rabbis. Somebody who can deliver you the scholarship and the knowledge and the spirituality of Torah because he himself received it from someone who received it, etc., etc. Become part of the Masorah, Asei lecha rav, and continues the Perish. V'al tish'an al binoscha lilmoid mipi hasvara. The one grave error that clever people make is they think, because I'm clever, I'm going to know it all much better than anybody else who can teach me. After all, I'm so clever. And geniuses and people who are bright are often done over by their own genius. They shortchange themselves because they think they have nothing to learn from anyone else. How stupid. You can be so clever and so stupid at the same time. What are you talking about? You've got nothing to learn from anyone else. You've got plenty to learn from everyone. And this is a recurring theme in Pirkei Avot. Don't think you know it better. Don't be arrogant. Don't be pompous. Don't take yourself so seriously. Don't dismiss others in so many ways. You're going to see as the weeks and months ahead unfold, and we're going to look more and more at the mishnayos and the teachings of Pirkei Avot. You're going to see this is a repeated theme. Aseh lecha. Make sure that you find a mentor. Make sure that you find someone who can give you guidance. And don't seek to criticize them or to find reasons not to listen to them. Of course, you can take it to the ultimate level if you want to be a chassid who has a rebbe, somebody who has complete faith in the person who is leading the group, the sect, etc., the community. The Mishnah doesn't necessarily mean that. It doesn't say aseh lechem rav. It says aseh lecha rav. You as an individual have to always have somebody for whom you have great respect and reverence, and from whom you can learn things that you don't know, because they can certainly add to your knowledge and to your depth and to your breadth. Continues the Perish. Va'afilu im einoi roi liyos lechol rav shehu b'dargoscha b'chochma oilamata mimcha. Even if somebody is not at the level perhaps that you would think that they can be your teacher, they're on your level, the same level as you, or even perhaps lower than you in some way, simahu l'rav alecha. You should still place them as a rabbi over you, as a teacher. You know, that's one of the great flaws of human nature. We're all critics. We may not write a column for a newspaper. We may not be pundits on CNN, but we all fancy ourselves as professional critics. And we meet someone, we say, I don't like the way he speaks. I'm not sure how much he really knows about the economy, about politics, about geography, about geology, about history, about any number of subjects. That's not what we're talking about. Does he know something about Torah or about teaching Torah that can increase your level of knowledge of Torah? Aseh lecha rav. Find yourself a teacher. Don't judge him as being unworthy of that position because of some perceived flaw. Everyone has flaws. By the way, look in the mirror. Believe it or not, I do on quite a regular basis. I've also got flaws. I think you do too. We all do. How would people react if somebody had to make us into the Rav? By the way, Shlomo Carlebach used to say something beautiful. You know what he used to say? Aseh lecha rav. Make yourself a Rebbe. Elevate yourself to the level that other people will consider you a Rebbe. Aseh lecha rav. Make yourself into a Rav. Beautiful idea, isn't it? Don't ever think that you are unworthy of that position. Ultimately, you must be ready to learn from others and to teach others. You're not put here on this world because you're a paradigm of perfection. You're not put here on this world to believe that you know it better than everybody else. You must take advice. You must be ready to receive advice and to listen to advice in such a way that you can improve yourself. You must be ready to learn from others, because no matter how clever you are, there is always something that you can learn from somebody else that you might not have thought of yourself if you would have gone through the material on your own. That's just a fact. Aseh lecha rav. Lefi she'enoi doimeh haloimed me'atzmai leloimed me'zulasai she'al yedei zeh toirasai mishtameres beyodai. There is no comparison learning something on your own or learning it from some outside source, from somebody who's teaching it to you. If you learn something on your own, it doesn't have the same retention. You may not remember it, but if you hear a presentation of some subject from somebody else who knows so much about it, then you will not just learn it at that moment, you'll be able to retain it and remember it. You'll be able to store it away in your brain filing cabinet so that you can take it out of that filing cabinet when you need it again. There's another element to this aseh lecha rav, and then we'll move on to the next part of the Mishnah. The Mefarshim say aseh lecha rav, doesn't say aseh lecha rabbonim. Doesn't say find multiple teachers. Have you ever heard of the multiple teacher theory? The multiple teacher theory is, if, it's like people who go to more than one doctor. If I don't like what the first doctor tells me, I'll go to the second one or to the third one or the fourth until I reach a doctor who says something I like. The multi-rabbi or multi-teacher theory is, I will pigeonhole my teacher so that teachers, each one of them will teach me the thing that I think I can learn from them, but I'm not going to learn everything from one person. I'm not going to have one systematic approach that's delivered to me by one particular pedagogue. I'm going to go to multiple pedagogues. That's not a system of learning. In Judaism, we have this idea, aseh lecha rav, say the Mefarshim. Find one overarching teacher. That doesn't mean you can never learn from anybody else, but there should be one particular person from whom you learn what's known in the yeshiva world as derech halimud, how to learn, and that you go back to, and once they've passed on, you have chaverim, you have contemporaries who study together with you and that person, with whom you share a particular system of learning, of Torah knowledge. You are part of a system, part of an institution, part of a group that learnt from one particular individual. Aseh lecha rav. Find one person. Find one person who can be your mentor for as long as that is possible. Because if you learn from scattered sources, your knowledge will be scattered. If you learn from multiple different people, you'll never be able to organize yourself in quite the same way as if you learn from one individual. That's not a limitation, by the way. It's a platform for greater acquisition of knowledge. Because if you are firm in your foundation of Torah knowledge, that will give you a confidence that you'd never have if you're always running from pillar to post. Okay, we'll move on to the next part of the Mishnah. It says, Uknei lecha chaver. So, aseh lecha rav, find yourself and make yourself someone as your teacher. But the next thing is knei lecha chaver. That's much harder. Knei is kinyan, acquire a friend. Acquire an acquaintance, somebody who is your counterpart at your level. Why do you have to acquire them? That's hard. Because a teacher's a teacher. You go into a teacher's class, they teach you, and you have knowledge from them, but you're not their contemporary. There's always this distance between you and a teacher. But a chaver, he may not like you. So you've got to work much harder to make friends. Find yourself somebody who is worthy of being a friend. A chaver, by the way, is the highest level of friend in the Hebrew context. The word chaver, somebody who brings you together. He creates a chibur. That is a true friend, somebody who increases who you are, who increases via the relationship, both of you, making you greater than the sum of your parts. That is what you need to do, and that's hard. Find that person, and to maintain that relationship is very difficult. But if you want to be somebody who is sound and stable in life, knei lecha chaver. Don't be superficial. Don't just have acquaintances with whom you can have a beer in the pub. That's not what life is about. Make sure that you have someone who is a chaver and work hard to acquire that person. Knei lecha chaver. And finally, v'hevedon es kol ha'odam lechav zchus. Make sure to judge every individual in the finest possible way, in the most positive way. You meet someone, you don't know who they are. It's not your chaver, it's not your rebbe. You don't know who they are. You just meet them, you bump into them, and then you see them doing something. Now you could judge them negatively, or you could judge them positively based on the very same thing that they've done. be don lechavschus. Make yourself into such a person that whenever you see somebody doing something which may be a little bit questionable, that you prefer to think of them as a tzaddik rather than a rasha. That is a characteristic, a character trait, which is so important, and which, by the way, as professional critics, we have some difficulty with, because we're so busy judging people negatively, aren't we? We always look at the negative in people. We're always looking for some reason to criticize them. Somehow it makes us feel better about ourselves because we know that perhaps we're being judged. And sometimes we are being judged. And therefore we will judge the person who judges us negatively, rather than taking it to heart that perhaps the critique that is being directed at us is to improve us. We have to be don lechavschus, even those who criticize us, but make sure that we don't become meaningless, vacuous critics who seek to elevate ourselves to a position in which we do not belong, simply because we found fault in others. And that's the end of the Mishnah. We'll leave it here for today. It's such a pleasure to be able to share these Mishnais from Pirkei Avot with you, and hopefully you'll join me again for my next share, and either live on Zoom or here on YouTube. I'm grateful to you for joining me. Thank you.